In this lecture, we will be examining the American labor movement in the period of the First World War. The war also set off a period of significant labor unrest on the home front, and the evolution of the modern American labor movement had much to do with conditions during the war. The IWW, or International Workers of the World, was a labor organization that was near the peak of its power as World War I broke out in Europe. The IWW, being rather left-leaning in its political orientation, denounced the war as a conflict brought about by capitalist powers for their own profit, and that the poor and the working class were fighting as proxies for wealthy capitalists. The following is a quote from a 1914 IWW platform denouncing the war. "We, as members of the Industrial Army, will refuse to fight for any purpose except the realization of industrial freedom." In 1917, the U.S. ended its official stance of neutrality and entered the war. The IWW did not suspend strikes in which it was participating, arguing that the struggle for the rights of workers was at least equal to supporting one's nation in wartime. The other major organization competing with the IWW at the time was the American Federation of Labor, or AFL. The AFL was much more conservative in its political leanings than the IWW. AFL President Samuel Gompers initially opposed American participation in the war. Like many Americans at the time, he was an isolationist and believed the U.S. should stay out of what he considered to be a European conflict. By 1916, though, Gompers and the AFL had gradually moved away from opposing the war to a cautious support for American participation in the war. Gompers worried about German U-boat attacks on American shipping, and he also believed that the war offered new opportunities for labor with greater employment and a more powerful voice in government. By 1917, Gompers and the AFL completely supported the war effort. Socialists and radicals denounced the AFL for selling out to the war effort. The year of 1917 was a year in which there was considerable labor unrest in the U.S. The high inflation levels ate into the earning power of wages earned by workers. And there was also something of a backlash against wartime sacrifice. The wartime draft led to significant labor shortages on the home front, and workers understood this was an opportunity to apply pressure to employers. The IWW in particular was especially militant in this time period, and the majority of the 4,450 strikes that year were organized by the IWW. Approximately 1 million or so workers went out on strike in 1917, and companies involved in supplying the war needs were especially targeted for strikes. President Wilson at the time adopted a fairly accommodating stance toward unions, unlike the harsher responses that would be dished out toward unions after the war. The number of union members in the United States was over 4 million people, a figure that was 35% higher than membership levels before the war. In general, wages rose significantly in the manufacturing, mining, and the transportation sectors. In most sectors of the economy, workers enjoyed at least some rise in wages over the course of the war. This was also a time when unions increasingly gained recognition by employers. However, the returning soldiers represented a sudden influx of workers in the labor market, leading to a labor surplus that had a negative effect on wages. This, too, was a time of increasing concern about communism and political radicalism, as the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution ushered in the Communist Soviet Union. Socialist and communist governments appeared in other parts of Europe as well, including a failed communist revolution in Berlin. And American political leaders, of course, were fully aware of these events. American industrial leaders and political leaders fearful that the same sort of revolution would happen in the United States. After the war, union members were very desirous of keeping the gains they had accrued during the war years. This was a time in which many previously disadvantaged groups who had faced discrimination wanted greater rights. Immigrants, women, and African Americans all demanded greater equality. However, employers, due to this post-war labor surplus, were in a much better position to fight the power of workers and unions. Many businesses began to withdraw wartime concessions and in some cases attempted to roll back wages to pre-war levels. The most famous of the many strikes in the period from 1918 to 1919 was the Seattle General Strike. It was led by IWW activists, and the strike began with Seattle shipyard workers. At its peak, about 60,000 workers walked out in a variety of industries. The strike only lasted 5 days, but it received a great deal of nationwide publicity. The mayor of Seattle made the claim that the strike was a Bolshevik plot to start a communist revolution in America, and that he saved the country with his heroism. Thousands of troops and hired thugs suppressed the strikers, and ended the walkout. Interestingly, the AFL also worked to end this strike. This was in part a competitive ploy to lure IWW members to the AFL, and in part Samuel Gompers, as president of the AFL, was simply much more politically conservative. He also thought this would be a way to sort of ingratiate his organization with the federal government. After the war, public opinion began to turn against unions and left-leaning politics. President Wilson was occupied for months in Paris at the Versailles peace talks, and he did not take an active role in addressing labor unrest at home in the U.S. One major attempt to mediate the conflicts was a failure. The 1919 National Industrial Conference brought together leading industrial leaders, government officials, and the AFL. The IWW was not invited, although it was likely that the group would not have joined the conference anyhow, even if they'd been invited. From the start, it was clear that corporate interests were united in their opposition to any concessions to organized labor. At the same time, the U.S. government began targeting communists and radicals in an organized campaign to disrupt their activities and weaken their strength. We enter a period that we now call the First Red Scare from 1919 to 1921. In April 1919, federal officials uncovered a plot to mail dozens of bombs to prominent American political and industrial leaders. Around the country, radicals, communists, and socialists were arrested and detained, and most of the April bombs were discovered before being delivered. Several people were injured by explosions, but the first wave of bombs resulted in no fatalities. However, on June 2nd of 1919, 8 explosive devices detonated in 8 different U.S. cities. These were much larger explosive devices, and 2 people died in this second wave of attacks. One of the dead, I should add, was an anarchist who was associated with the bomb designers. The home of U.S. Attorney General was targeted by the bombers. A. Mitchell Palmer, the Attorney General, ordered the Justice Department to begin what was later known as the Palmer Raids. Nearly 10,000 people were arrested, and over 3,500 of the arrested people were detained in jails and prisons, many of them not getting due process under the Constitution. In the aftermath of the Palmer Raids, numerous states passed criminal syndicalism laws that made it much easier to convict suspected subversives and terrorists. All a prosecutor had to do was to prove that a person was connected to an organization associated with criminal activity. This was a legal form of guilt by association, and sort of a forerunner to the modern-day RICO statutes that are used frequently to indict and convict organized crime members. Nearly 600 people who were legally in the United States were deported simply on the basis of their political beliefs. Even speaking out about violence for the purposes of political change became a crime. Other states passed laws making it illegal, for example, to raise a flag with the color red, since this color was associated with communism. In 1920, a number of legislators in the state of New York were denied the right to sit in the state legislature because they happened to be members of the Socialist Party. Still, it was several years before this first Red Scare died down, and many thousands of American citizens were denied their constitutional rights in the name of fighting communism and anarchism. And this brings to a close our brief look at American labor during the First World War.